Back then, a gravel road led through the covered bridge, past the house where my mother was born, and on up the mountain to Maxey Flat. That's my Aunt Belle talking to my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother was born on this mountain January 1st, 1900. She saw most of the 20th century, and a lot of it from up here. This mountain has been in my dreams as long as I can remember. That's my Uncle Ike. That's his farm. Just down the road was the farm that belonged to my great-grandfather. In the fall of 1962, my Uncle Ike got some new neighbors. Meanwhile, down in Texas, Kennedy was speaking to an assembled crowd at Rice University. He needed to convince Texans that a lot of the money for the space program would stay in Texas. His speech included a warning about the pace of technology.
We meet at a college noted for knowledge, in a city noted for progress, in a state noted for strength, and we stand in need of all three. For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, despite the fact that this nation's own scientific manpower is doubling every 12 years in a rate of growth more than 3 times that of our population as a whole, despite that, the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old.
But to those cold warriors, how big a concern were those new ills? Winning the arms race was much more important to them than where we dumped the byproducts of that research. The people of eastern Kentucky had no idea what was in store for them. Maxey Flat is a small hilltop community in eastern Kentucky. My family first moved here in the late 1700s. Land that was once a family farm became a radioactive waste site there. The land that became the radioactive waste site was actually the farm of my great-grandfather, Almus Manning. The sale of that family farm has had consequences for everyone living on Maxey Flat. I wanted to find out a little bit more about exactly what those consequences had been. My first stop was the Flemingsburg Library. There's a federal archive here of documentation pertaining to Maxey Flat. As you can probably imagine, projects like this take place under layers upon layers of bureaucracy. Digging through the spiral-bound notebooks that contain the information about the site can be really frustrating. For instance, planning for the site started under the Kentucky Division of Nuclear Information, which was replaced by the Division of Atomic Development, which turned over its authority to the Kentucky Atomic Energy Authority, which eventually became the Kentucky Science and Technology Commission. The site started construction in 1962 and got its operational license in January of 1963. Radioactive waste was buried at the site in large, unlined trenches. Typically, they were 360 feet long, 70 feet wide, and 20 feet deep. 52 of these trenches were eventually excavated. In these photographs from 1976, you can see a trench being filled. Some of the waste arrived in barrels. Some of the waste arrived in large cardboard boxes, sort of like appliance boxes. This EPA photograph from 1979 is captioned, "Burial Trench 43 in the Shale of the Nancy Member, Borden Formation." You can see how the waste was deposited in the trenches. Here you can see a map of the 52 trenches, which becomes considerably more interesting when you note that the area is on top of a plateau surrounded on three sides by streams. Streams which happen to feed into the main water supply for the Moorhead area. Maxey Flat opened under the management of Nuclear Engineering Company, or NECO for short. When news of groundwater contamination started to make it into the press, they changed their name to American Ecology. They're still one of the biggest companies in the business. A problem that occurred here at Maxey Flat and also at West Valley, New York, was what's called the bathtub effect. With just under 50 inches of rainfall annually, the trenches on top of Maxey Flat, which were full of radioactive waste, also filled with water, which became radioactive water. A lot of radioactive water. Because of Maxey Flat's hilltop location, that water ran off down the sides of the mountain and into the nearby springs. In 1973, the plant manager had an idea. He'd figured out how to get rid of all that radioactive water building up on Maxey Flat. He put in an evaporator. Radioactive water became radioactive steam from 1973 to 1986. 6 million gallons were disposed of this way. What happens when you dump that much radioactive waste into an environment?
It's Gojira!
Okay, so looking around, I didn't see any fire-breathing mutant lizards. But what about all that stuff they told us in school about radiation being bad for you?
For an informal review of nuclear radiations and their effect on humans, a sunlit pool with all the trimmings serves as a suitable launching spot, offering an approach that is sufficiently scientific and scenic. A sunbather exposes herself to an assortment of radiations. Some, such as the solar rays, are heaven sent. Others are nuclear, the same as those which come from an atomic burst, and they're bombarding her from all sides. From the sky in the form of cosmic rays, from radon, a material in the atmosphere, from radioactive uranium found in the water which she just left, and in the earth on which she now lies. They aren't powerful enough to bother our bather. They're less of a hazard than the rays of the sun, which, if carelessly taken, can become too much of a good thing. With all radiations, nuclear and otherwise, it depends on the duration and intensity of the exposure. Nuclear radiations have their novel way of causing injury, but it's neither mysterious nor inescapable. Radioactivity, as represented by the ball, causes electrons to be ejected from their atom. It's an offensive move based on ionization. Ionization disrupts the structure of atoms of which all living matter is composed. An atom is part of a molecule, and molecules are parts of the cell. The cell is the structural and functional unit of all living matter, a tiny machine with a basic job to do. Cells operating with thousands of other cells of various shapes and performing special chores make up tissues and organs. Organs are departments in a complex factory, the human body, which is engaged in the manufacture of an important product, life. An atom then seems unimportant and infinitesimal, a tiny cog on a small wheel in a miniature machine which, if multiplied millions of times, forms the going concern that is you. But if enough of the cogs are broken through ionizing radiation, the gears grind, the machines falter and stop, the factory shuts down. Each of the 4 kinds of missiles discharged by radioactive substances has its own ballistic behavior. To observe them attacking the body, they must be symbolized far out of proportion, magnified millions of times. Gamma rays are the most penetrating, but the least ionizing. Not so penetrating, but more ionizing, are neutrons, which are not rays, but particles. Neutrons and gamma rays are external dangers, able to shoot into the human body easily. Alpha particles cannot penetrate the skin. Beta particles can cause surface burns if the assault is sufficiently concentrated and sustained. Both are able to gain entry through the eating and breathing of radioactive matter or via breaks in the skin. Once inside, this so-called hot stuff takes up residence in various parts of the body, giving off highly ionizing alpha and beta particles. And how long does this radio rat race go on? The body will succeed in casting off some of this material, but it is a long, slow process. There's no effective method for dislodging the stuff. No known way of neutralizing or destroying it. There is no method of hastening its half-life, which is the time required for 50% of the substance to decay. With some substances, it is a matter of less than a second. But if you had some plutonium inside you, you wouldn't make any plans to celebrate the event. Plutonium's half-life is 24,000 years. The various kinds of cells which make up the parts of the body differ in their vulnerability to radiations. Most sensitive are lymph cells, such as those found in the tonsils. Next is bone marrow, which manufactures red and white blood cells. Then the sex cells, followed by tendons and cartilage, as in the nose. Muscles and nerves, the toughest of all. In general, cells which reproduce rapidly and whose efficient functioning depends on that ability are most affected. radiation halts their reproduction, which is a simple process of one cell dividing into two. This destructiveness has been harnessed and put to work in the radium treatment of cancer, which consists of cells that have gone wild and multiplied too fast. The manifestations of radiation in the body are many and range from slight to severe. Loss of hair, nausea, bleeding, inability of the body to resist other ailments and make its own repairs. These are some of them, and they may be climaxed by the ultimate symptom, death itself.
After a little digging, I found that a health impact study had been done in 1989. The Department of Health and Human Services sent someone out to look at the site and make recommendations. The report said the site was of no public health concern. That seemed odd to me, given that Maxey Flat has some of the highest plutonium groundwater contamination numbers in the world. I thought it might be a good idea to get a hold of the author of the report and see what he had to say about the site. It took a little doing with media liaisons, and I had to clear the questions through DC, but I finally got to ask Dr. Sharp about that evaporator at Maxey Flat. So, what did you feel about that?
I thought that was a very appropriate system to use because there is really no cost-effective way of removing tritium from water, because the hydrogen that makes up 2/3 of the atoms in the water is chemically identical to tritium. So if you have standard water and tritium, the two will intermix, and you won't know one is radioactive. And when you try to chemically separate it, unless you do some really fancy chemistry, you can't separate out the two. So the best available technologies for tritium removal are either don't remove it or evaporate it to reduce the volume of whatever's left. And when you evaporate the water, you evaporate some of the tritium and it goes out as a gas. Now, tritium, in some instances, depending on who you talk to, tritium is either the safest of all the radioactive materials or it's the most dangerous. And the reason why I say that is it's safe because it has a very, very low energy associated with this radioactive decay. But because of that low energy, you don't necessarily know it's there, which makes it one of the most dangerous ones. So you can see a puddle of water, stick your hand in it, and you may not know it's radioactive, and you may not have any effects from it, but it's still radioactive. That's why I say it's the safest, because it has a very low energy, and it's the could be the most dangerous because you don't know it's there. So I think the evaporator that they used at Maxey Flats was an appropriate technology to reduce the volume of the water that infiltrated all the trenches and storage containers. Those materials are in special burial areas around the site. Mm-hmm. And although the site is, as I understand it, is constantly patrolled, the sites where the plutonium and the enriched uranium are buried are even more highly controlled than the other sites. So the public health issues are not really existent, because if people can't get to the sites because of the patrols, then what we look for is if there's no contact, there's no pathway of exposure. If there's no pathway of exposure, you can't be affected by it. The next issue then would be, will that material seep out of the trenches and the containers? Well, the cap is supposed to prevent that. So we don't see that as a major concern. The other thing too is that a lot of these uranium and plutonium isotopes are not very water soluble. So even if they did get wet, they get wet, but they won't move very much. And if they do move, if there's any clay around that area, they will bind to the clay and it will just stay in place. I would like to say that, Maxey Flats was really started in the early days of radioactive waste disposal, and the government set up a few of these sites, and Maxey Flats never really should have been there, from what I've read. They set one up in Illinois, in Sheffield, and it had kind of like the same problem. It's called the bathtub effect. Water gets in there, overflows, and goes out. And you learn from your mistakes. And people have said, well, we don't want these disposal sites in our backyard. I can understand that. I sometimes wonder, what would I do if I had one in my backyard? But there have been more benefits from the use of nuclear power than not having it. And I still think to this day that the biggest problem is the waste disposal. And in fact, when I was hired by the CDC, my future boss said, what do you think of nuclear power? I said, until they develop solar, wind, or some other type of activity, it's the only thing that's going to save us from the oil crisis. And this was over 20 years ago. And I said, the biggest problem 20 years ago, which is today, is what to do with the waste. So, unfortunately, Maxey Flats happened, and it happened. So.
When I got ready to start this project, I contacted the EPA's Region 4 office. They directed me to the Office of Media Relations, where Don Harris-Young, my media liaison, told me that the EPA would have nothing to do with a project about Maxey Flat. I was kind of surprised that a public agency could decline participation in a project about, well, public matters. It's come out recently that the EPA has been under a lot of pressure from our current administration. During the time I've worked on this film, I've met a lot of great people from the Region 4 office. I like to think that if their hands weren't tied, they would have been a lot more helpful. From Maxey Flat, the closest large town is Moorhead. It's a few miles away to the southeast. It's a college town of about 6,000 people. I spent quite a bit of time here while I was working on my project. Shortly after I arrived, I decided to place an ad in the local newspaper. I hoped to interview people who had worked at the site, families that had been in the area a long time. The Moorhead News is the only local newspaper. This is the ad I placed. The day I placed the ad, I got a call from an assistant of Robert McCulloch, the publisher. I eventually spoke to Mr. McCulloch himself. He said the Moorhead News wouldn't run my ad. He said some of that stuff went in the ground 20, 30 years ago. There's no way of knowing that it's even still radioactive. I tried to explain to him just how long plutonium stays radioactive, but he wasn't hearing it. I suspect he already knew. Just when I was starting to feel really cynical about the local media, I got a call from Moorhead State Public Radio.
Good day and welcome to the front page. I'm Dan Conti, sitting in for Chuck Mraz, and our guest today is independent filmmaker Robert Jackson. He's here to talk about a project he's been working on that concerns Maxey Flats. Maxey Flats is the nuclear waste disposal site in southern Fleming County. It operated from 1963 to 1978, and it's the place where the U.S. government and private operators disposed of low-level radioactive waste from military ships, hospitals, and companies. It's estimated that nearly 5 million cubic feet of waste is buried at the landfill, which covers 280 acres. Maxey Flats was closed in 1977 after it was discovered that radioactive water had leaked from burial trenches at the landfill and spread to other areas of the site. Mr. Jackson, from what I have read, when Maxey Flats was operational, radioactive waste was dumped into 46 unlined earthen trenches there. From your research, do you know if that was the approved method of disposal, or was this a violation of the government's agreement with private contractors who ran that landfill?
Well, actually, one of the most interesting. Oh, and let me just correct you real quick. All the documents call it Maxey Flats, plural.
Okay.
But it's actually Maxey Flat, singular, and that's one of the things that I see over and over in the documentation. You know, it's just one of those things I wanted to clear up. Under the old Atomic Energy Commission, there weren't a lot of regulations about waste disposal. One of the really interesting things about researching this project is finding out that really, in a legal sense, there's never been any wrongdoing. They may have bent the law, like the evaporator was bending the law, in my opinion. They knew that if the air quality was measured at the same level that the steam was going out, that they'd fail. But, you know, so that was one of those things where they were pushing it. But generally, the things that were done out there, there were no controls. There were no serious controls on that kind of waste, and it's a lot of it's because of the type of waste. They call it low-level radioactive waste, but when the Atomic Energy Commission set up the categories, there were only two categories. There was high-level waste, which were fuel rods from reactors, and everything else was low-level waste. And so in a lot of cases, the low-level waste was much, much more radioactive than the high-level waste. In some cases, plutonium that was used for weapons development, or, there are a lot of different things out there that are really, really nasty. The real hero of the area, in my opinion, is a man named John P. Hay. He was the first of the local citizens to start questioning what was going in the ground up there. And he started a citizens protest group. They actually ended up having the longest-running federal tag grant in the history of the program. And if it weren't for Mr. Hay, the site might have run another 10 years. But he was vigilant about making sure that people knew what was up there and finding out what the truth was about the quality of the groundwater, and that, you know, whether or not there was off-site contamination. And really, I think he gets forgotten, but to me, a lot of the story is Mr. Hay.
And I trust you had a chance to talk to him?
No, he's deceased. He died some years back. I've spoken to his daughter and his widow, and they have an incredible wealth of information dating back to the early days of the site. He was an electrician, but he apparently spent every waking moment that he wasn't at work studying what was going on at Maxey Flat and finding other people who'd listen to him. Because, you know, radiation's not one of those things like having a gun put to your head. It's not you don't see it as a direct threat. You can't perceive that you're being injured. You know, it's just, it's insidious that way. It's something that seeps into the environment and changes things, but slowly and without a lot of, you know, visible warning signs. So it's a hard sell when you're trying to tell your neighbors that maybe their water's polluted. And I don't think there was ever an intention of malice there. The governor who approved it in the first place, Burt Combs, who's dead now, but his wife is the Chief Justice on the Kentucky Court of Appeals. He was a good governor. He put in a lot of roads and power plants and water processing facilities, and he was building infrastructure in Kentucky at a time when, you know, Kentucky both needed the jobs and needed the infrastructure. And my understanding is that by being the very first state to go to the Atomic Energy Commission and say, you know, that we want to be involved in your nuclear programs, he thought Kentucky would end up getting an atomic power plant. And he really wanted Kentucky to be on the cutting edge of technology. He wanted to bring those jobs here, and he wanted to do something good for the state. The groundwater numbers, they stopped testing for everything but tritium back in about 1988. And at the point that they stopped testing the groundwater for plutonium, the plutonium concentration in the groundwater up there was about 7.5 times the legal limit, according to the figures in the archives. And so when I asked the Commonwealth, because the Cabinet for Health Services currently takes care of the testing, they told me that they don't just give those figures out, and I actually still haven't got figures for current plutonium groundwater concentrations from the Commonwealth. So that's something I'm still working on. I sent them a registered letter requesting, because that's what they told me I'd have to do, and still haven't heard anything back, but that doesn't mean that they won't get back in touch with me.
Did they tell you why they stopped testing in 1988?
Yeah, the common thinking, I guess, about the hazard up there is that the radioactive tritium is the only hazard, which seems odd to me because the plutonium, the thorium, the barium, there are a lot of hazardous things. There's cesium, uranium, several uranium isotopes, several plutonium isotopes. There's some stuff out there that's a lot nastier than tritium. Tritium's a fairly benign isotope. It's just radioactive hydrogen in and out of your body in a few days and not very radioactive. And, I don't know. It seems to me kind of that they're focusing on one of the less important isotopes out there, but although they put a lot of it into the atmosphere. They, from 1973 to 1986, they had 6 million gallons of radioactive water full of tritium. And they, at the time, the EPA's specification for air quality was testing at close to ground level. So they put up a 150-foot tall smokestack and sent it out as steam over the county. So that radioactive water was coming down in the rainfall for quite a while, like I said, 73 to 86. And so they do have a good reason to be looking for tritium in the environment because they put a lot of it there. They put 6 million gallons of it there.
It would take Yankee Stadium full of dynamite to equal the energy released in the complete fission of an amount of U-235 the size of a baseball. With this discovery at the time the free world faced a war for survival, it was little wonder the first thought was a weapon. But how to obtain enough material for even a single bomb? Only a small fraction of natural uranium is the U-235 isotope, which will fission in a chain reaction. And to separate enough U-235 quickly enough seemed all but impossible. But the impossible became reality as industry, labor, science, and the military combined their efforts to build Oak Ridge, where enough U-235 was separated to build the first atomic bomb.
A lot of the waste at Maxey Flat came from Oak Ridge, America's secret city, not indicated on any maps until the late 40s. Built in a 17-mile-long valley, both to keep it isolated geographically and in case it exploded. I was lucky enough to set up an interview with Bernard Cohen, who had been the leader of the cyclotron project at Oak Ridge.
So, in fact, I just finished a review paper about all the new evidence, which is pointing to the idea that low-level radiation is not harmful at all and may well be protective against cancer. So, we know from the effects of high doses, say from the Japanese A-bomb survivors and other medical things and stuff like that. And if you assume it's just proportional, that is, if you get a millionth as much radiation, you have a millionth as much risk. That's what the linear theory is. And all the evidence is that if you get even a hundredth as much radiation, you get much less than a hundredth as much risk. And maybe even zero risk, and maybe even a negative risk. In other words, maybe it even protects against cancer. Because you're getting all these damaging events from metabolic chemical processes, and so if you increase the production of repair mechanisms, that protects you against that other, the chemical attacks too. Well, the big danger from plutonium is if it gets as a very fine dust suspended in the air, and there it's it's not infinitely dangerous, but it's as dangerous as, it's one of the more dangerous things in the world to inhale plutonium dust. Cesium is one of the more common problems. Like, for example, from Chernobyl, there was a lot of this radioactive cesium got released and got into the ground, and there's worries that food grown on that land will pick up some of this radioactivity and expose people to radiation. Although that's a debatable issue, but it's it's immeasurable. I mean, you can measure the cesium there on the ground and so forth. So if there's enough cesium getting into the food supply, that could be a problem, certainly. So the environmental impacts of the nuclear power compared to coal burning are vastly superior for nuclear. Of course, if you talk about global warming, nuclear power produces no global warming, whereas coal is one of the big sinners, one of the big causes of global warming. If you talk about acid rain, coal-fired plants are one of the big causes of acid rain, which destroys trees and forests, things like that, does harm to fisheries. Well, nuclear power does none of that, so it avoids the acid rain problem. There's all sorts of other problems from coal. There's strip mining, of course, is a big issue with coal, especially maybe in Kentucky.
Mountaintop mining, yeah.
And of course, with the nuclear power, the amount of mining is very, very much less. So it avoids the strip mining problems, the acid mine drainage problems, the waste piles. There are coal mines that have been burning for I think maybe as much as 100 years, spewing out all sorts of air pollutants and stuff. Well, the radioactive waste issue is the thing which seems to have everybody upset. And gee, I could go on for a long time talking about that. What are we going to do with, you might say, what are we going to do with the radioactive waste? We're going to convert it into a rock and put it in the natural habitat of rocks, which is deep underground. Now, how do you know it'll be safe? Well, we know all about how rocks behave, and if you assume that the nuclear waste, which has been converted into a rock, behaves anything like ordinary rock, it's just extremely safe. Well, the second biggest issue ordinarily is reactor accidents. And there's, of course, everybody knows about 3 Mile Island accident, which is the only accident, by far the biggest accident there's ever been in the United States. And nobody died from that accident. In a reactor you make plutonium, which can then be used to make bombs. It's not the big problem with American type reactors is that you make plutonium is made from uranium in the reactor, and if you leave, ordinarily the fuel in an American reactor stays in for 3 years. So by the time it's taken out, the plutonium has been converted. A lot of plutonium has been converted into another type of plutonium, which makes it unsuitable for bombs. You could still make a lousy bomb with it, but nobody's ever made a real bomb with it. And it would be enough to blow up a building or maybe a city block, but it wouldn't obliterate a city. So this is what's called reactor-grade plutonium. And it's even with good plutonium, so if you want to make a bomb, you have to leave the fuel in a reactor only for a very short time, maybe like 1 month or so. And that's the way plutonium is made for bombs. Like United States and Russia and a lot of other countries have made a lot of plutonium for bombs, always by leaving the fuel in a reactor for something like 30 days or so. But if you can't do that with an ordinary power reactor, because it's just to change the fuel takes 30 days. So you can't run it for 30 days and then change it. It would be terribly inefficient. And it's also expensive to stop the reactor and refuel it, and take the fuel out and stuff like that. So for American reactors, the proliferation, the idea that the plutonium being made is can be used to make bombs is not a terribly big thing. But of course they still guard it. They keep very close track of the plutonium at all stages. I mean, you have to do a lot with it before it's a bomb. You don't pull it out of the ground and there's a bomb. I mean, you have to do chemistry on it and purify it, and then you have to mold it into certain shapes and stuff like that. And you wouldn't live to see the end of that project unless you had a big group, or, well, if you knew what you were doing, you know, if you had a multi-million-dollar laboratory and equipment and stuff, it could be done. But it's not something that
4 or 5 guys aren't going to run up there and harvest a bomb.
That's for damn sure.
What's going on?
You got yourself a front seat to something you're not going to forget so quick. See that hill? You'll see it light up like you never saw light before. Any minute now, they're going to test an atomic bomb.
Dad, let's turn back.
Wouldn't get very far. Ought to go off any minute now.
But what about Vivian? She'll be terrified.
It'll be just like fireworks for her. She doesn't know what it means. We'll be the ones who'll be frightened.
In 1962, the Department of Energy detonated a weapon made with reactor-grade plutonium. The test was classified for decades. Because reactor-grade plutonium is so much more radioactive than weapons-grade plutonium, it's difficult to work with. It requires more shielding in the bomb assembly area to keep the workers safe. The additional radiation isn't good for the electronics in the weapon either. The yield of the weapon was only around 20 kilotons, just slightly more than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Making bombs from reactor-grade plutonium isn't a commercially viable endeavor. There's 1,000 pounds of reactor-grade waste at Maxey Flat. Several years ago, Homeland Security decided it was a national security issue. Their solution was to take down the sign so no one could find the facility, which is unattended nights and weekends. You can still recognize Maxey Flat. The road doesn't run through the covered bridge anymore, and it's paved now. My mother was born here in 1921. I brought her back to have a look around. She hadn't been back in a few years.
Now, we're not very far from the nuclear waste plant, and this is where my other granddad lived. And when he died, one of the boys tore down the house and rebuilt it. And my mother was raised here. This is the old barn that's been here for years and years.
Ever since I was a little kid, when I had dreams about being out in nature, it was always on this mountain. This mountain left an indelible impression on my mind when I was a kid. Part of the reason I wanted to do this project is a sort of sense of my own mortality that I've been feeling lately. A lot of generations of my ancestors are buried here in small family cemeteries.
This was my dad's father. His name was Elvis Manning, and he was married first to Dad's mother, and when she died, he married again, and he had 2 children by his first wife and 1 by his second wife.
Elmas was the last Manning to own the farm that became the waste dump.
This was my grandfather's farm. He had 160 acres here. His son-in-law, who was the sole survivor of the family at that time, sold it to the government, and they put in this unit back here for nuclear waste.
Maxey Flat accepted waste from nearly 1,000 U.S. companies and government organizations. This is a list of the companies that actually took responsibility. They call them PRPs, or potentially responsible parties. Each of these companies put some money towards the cleanup of Maxey Flat. They were bargain basement settlements, though. For instance, the Department of the Interior paid $4,803. The biggest of the federal de minimis settlers still paid less than $350,000. Ironically, that was the U.S. Public Health Service. Once the money had been collected, the state of Kentucky was presented with a number of options. Removing the waste and cleaning up the site was never really on the table. The option they chose was the cheapest, something called natural equilibrium. A tarp was placed over the site to keep water from getting down into the trenches, and given time, the site will allegedly regain a natural equilibrium. As bad as the destruction is at Maxey Flat, it's important to remember that mountains are being destroyed every day in Kentucky. It's called mountaintop removal. Using this technique, 9 guys can take down a mountain by themselves in the span of a few months. They blow the top of the mountain off until they get down to the coal seam. They don't even bother to clear the trees first. They don't have to worry about strikes anymore. They've eliminated most of the workers from the equation. They're destroying the Appalachians one mountain at a time. They wash the coal with billions of gallons of water that they store in huge ponds that leak into the local water supplies. They've already leveled an area the size of Delaware. They call this the Saudi Arabia of coal. Kentucky's no stranger to exploitation. This is a man-made disaster. Not only that, at the rate we're burning coal right now, we're pumping unprecedented quantities of mercury into the environment. A few days later, I tagged along on a tour of authors and poets from Kentucky as they visited people in the affected regions.
You see that pile of logs laying beside the road down there? Yeah. Now they got on my land and they cut them logs, and I found it out. I stopped them. And
how did you stop them?
I just walked and told them not cut no more. Leave it right where it's at.
Oh my gosh.
Leave it right where it's at and clean up the mess they had. The law is if they get on somebody else's land accidentally, then you pay them what you get out of the timber at the market price, and the damage for tearing your land up too. But if they get on it knowing better, you could prove that, then it's a felony. You could penitentiary them. So I don't know if he knew better or not, but I don't want to be hard on him. I told him, I said, if you won't pay me, I'll just take what your ordinary is going to pay her, but I want it moved before it lays there and runs. And he said he would, and if he don't, in the next few days, and I won't have no other alternative but to go get a warrant for him for stealing timber. So I'm not going to let him. I'm not going to move mine. This part here. None of this side of the mountain. None of it.
How long have you had this land?
I've had this land since 1947. And I bought this land back in here because when I was a child, I used to hunt back in here. I used to dig ginseng, And even when I was just a real young, I was raised in Camp Creek across the mountain. I'd bring a dog and Matic. Well, we didn't have guns that time. I'd groundhog hunt, and I'd dig ginseng and pick wild berries, crack walnuts and things, and I like this land.
The mountains on both sides of Damon Morgan's farm have been destroyed. That night we gathered at the Hindman School and listened as local residents told us what they'd been through.
So where do we start? We need to start from the beginning. And when you get older, you're able to say, I can remember when. Well, I can remember when we didn't have any of this mining like we see today, the strip mining. It started out with auger mining, what they called auger mining, and then it went to the strip mines. Of course, prior to that, we had the tunnel mines that didn't disturb the surface that much. But this was the most beautiful part of the world, in my opinion. I've traveled a little, not as much as some people, but I can remember when from Ashland to Pineville and from Pikeville to Kempton, it was all forest land, trees. The only thing you can compare it to would probably be, you can go to the Smokies now and you can see that one mountain range through there, but we had it half the state. Eastern Kentucky was all that way. And then they get the bright idea that it's easier to mine the coal by taking the heavy equipment and shoving the mountains down and ripping the heart out of the country that we love so much.
I've lived in these mountains all my life, my grandparents, great-grandparents, and being of Cherokee descendants, I can go back to the beginning of time in these mountains. And to see greed take over from everything else, that people's own conscience. And I wonder how many souls has been bought with this money. I wonder. And then I wonder how many souls has died from the impact of this.
As bad as it seems to be, it might even get worse. In January of 2000, former West Virginia State House of Delegates member H.L. Jack Snyder allegedly put together a proposal to depopulate Appalachia.
So unlike the situation in the early 1900s, up into the 1930s or the 1940s, or a little later, unlike that situation when it was to the benefit of the industry to have a large pool of labor to draw from because they needed it, now labor is less a part of the equation. They don't need large populations to draw from for the few people who are needed to run these mountaintop operations. So the people in the region essentially become non-entities. These folks, the developers, have a vision of what they see as the good society, or progress, or modernization, or what's going to benefit people. And there's a strong strain of paternalism running through this too. And this goes back to that racial, murky racial ground that I talked about earlier. The assumption that certain value systems reside almost naturally within the genetic makeup of certain cultural groups.
Sure.
Now that's less blatant now than it was 100 years ago, but 2 or 3 times removed, we have modernization theory, which is not based so much on race as it is on ideas of, okay, what certain people have been exposed to, what they've learned, what they value, and they value, urban, modern, high-tech, condensed population in commercial areas where they have access to a lot of services. This is seen as what people want and what people should want. Right? Well, a lot of folks don't fit into that model. And just as native Filipinos, in the countryside at least, did not fit into that particular model in the 1890s, and therefore were seen as racially inferior, sort of the bitter enders or the holdout folks on the margins of the mountaintop removal regions don't fit into that model now and are seen as essentially basically dispensable. Those who can be salvaged can only be salvaged by having access to the educational and employment models that the developers see as beneficial to society, for the public good. So this gets me to the document. I'm going to give you a copy of this document. It comes from a law office in Charleston, West Virginia. And the fellow is promoting what he sees as the ideal model for the depopulation of the Appalachian coal fields in the 21st century. And he has a caveat. He says, I don't think politically anybody's got the guts to really follow through with this, but here's the way it ought to be to have a progressive government in West Virginia and a progressive mining industry. And what he's proposing is the coerced, or voluntary, but it's primarily coerced, relocation of people in the coal regions with economic packages associated with it, college tuition for the kids, relocation settlement money, with the understanding that nobody will try to come back to the region. And if they do, they lose their benefits. Now, when you think about this kind of thinking, it's not that far removed from, say, urban renewal or the thinking behind the building of the Tennessee Valley Authority projects back in the 1930s. It's essentially the same idea. And for better or for worse, sometimes that worked out okay for people, and for the larger society in many ways. You can argue that it worked out well for the generation of electricity. Of course, then the TVA's got into strip mining and mountaintop removal,
Right.
and that's kind of a side issue. But the idea was that this was a public agency. This was at least a legitimate function that an enlightened state, we collectively more or less had a consensus that, well, there's going to be some rough spots here, and frankly, in the short term, some people are going to be screwed. But at least it's driving to the public good, the greater public good. And there was at least a general consensus that that's the way the TVA, or that's the way rural electrification, or that's the way Cave Run Lake, and the Corps of Engineers dam projects. It's a top-down model still.
Right.
It's a top-down decision-making process. But at least that decision-making process is vested in the hands of, at least indirectly, people who are supposed to be reflecting the political consensus of the body politic.
Right.
So therefore it is for the public good. Now what strikes me about particularly the project this gentleman from Charleston is proposing about depopulation of the Appalachian.
And what era
fields,
is this? When was this document?
2000.
Oh, so it's
2000.
very
This
recent.
is contemporary. Yeah. This is contemporary, and this is what is so mind blowing about it. Because to my view, with the exception of the language, and with the exception of some of the diminution of the racial undertones, it's not that much different from the models that were being handed down in the 1900s. But what strikes me as particularly, well, loathsome to me about this particular types of plans, yes, it is the violence that's done to a traditional culture. And if you're talking about, this is a big part of it, if you're talking about people in a democracy, we're supposed to be able to determine our own destinies and where we want to live and this type of thing. Of course, it's idealized. Everybody realizes it's not very possible to do that. But the very people who are trying to retain that and promote a sense of really old-style, small R Republican independence are the very people who are seen as dispensable. They're the most fundamentally American, really. And they want to preserve a certain way of life while not denying that there are certain compromises they need to make, and they have made. But it's these very people who are seen as the outgroups and the groups who need to be transformed into something else. If you're going to do that, if we as a culture are going to go along with that, at the very least, it has to be done with the larger goal of the public good, defined by the public itself, not the public good as defined by private corporations. So this idea of depopulation, which is so shocking on one level and so easy to dismiss, when the idea is promoted on the basis of genetics or race, well, I dismiss it on those grounds too, although there is a historical linkage to those old ideas and the new ideas. There's this idea of cultural hierarchies, cultural superiority, and a model of development and a use of resources that is best done by the private sector, and will lead inevitably to the public good. And in the meantime, what we've done is taken what we supposedly venerate in this country, self-community, self-organization, not necessarily self-sufficiency, but sustainable use of land, sustainable agriculture, all the things that are really necessary for a healthy society, and we've embraced a form of pathological development, which makes people more and more dependent on things they can't do themselves. And when you depopulate and you move folks from here to here and put them in an alien environment, if not a hostile environment, they may be able to go to Applebee's, or they may be able to go to Bennigan's or Walmart easily and routinely, but they've got to have an automobile, they've got to have a certain type of phone system, they've got to have air conditioning, all the things that divorce them farther and farther and farther from the types of things they were trying to hold on to back here in the mountains. Now, again, my premise is this is going to happen. I'm not optimistic about this being reversed, but if it's going to happen, at the very least, I think it needs to happen on the basis of a public dialogue, a public debate, and a determination by the people who are most affected about what the results are going to be.
Right.
And what land is going to be preserved for stewardship and this type of thing, not by some private coal operator or group of private coal operators because they claim to be acting in the public good, because frankly they're not acting in the public good. Well, they may think they are. They probably do think they are. Some of them sincerely believe they are. Others sincerely know that they're going to get political capital if they talk in terms of public good.
Right.
They don't give a damn about it. But
the thing that always strikes me about this is that you go to these small communities in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, and there's some of the last little pieces of America that actually feel like the America I grew up in. You know, that weren't centralized around access to services, or because everybody's crammed in these mega cities now, places like Atlanta and St. Louis that have become 60, 70 miles wide, and they're basically just consumer hubs where it's convenient to truck everything in, and
and this has become our primary role as citizens over the past, I'd say the past 100 years, but definitely the past 50 years, is primarily not as citizens, not as independent citizens, but as consumers, with the sort of patina of independence, the veneer of independence. So look at all the choices I have. Look at all the choices I have.
There are good choices that don't require the sacrifice of the mountains or the people who live on them. Consider a 100-watt light bulb burning year-round. It takes 715 pounds of coal to power that light bulb for a year. It takes over 7,000 cubic feet of natural gas, or over 50 gallons of oil, to equal the power generated by a fraction of a pound of uranium, something we have in abundance here in the United States. 8,900 tons of coal a day. That's 8,900-ton rail cars. That's how much coal it takes to power a 1,000-megawatt power plant every day. That produces 650 tons of ash and 7,500 tons of CO2. By contrast, a comparable nuclear power plant only uses an average of 370 pounds of fuel a day. Contrary to urban legend, the steam coming out of those cooling towers is clean water. It hasn't been inside a reactor or anything. I've got more reason than most to be suspicious of the nuclear industry. But given the choice between coal and nuclear, I don't think there's much choice at all. The amount of mercury being put into the environment through burning coal is terrifying. In 2004, the EPA's advisory listing for mercury contamination included 35% of the nation's lakes, 92% of the Atlantic coast, and 100% of the Gulf Coast. It's been suggested that recent spikes in infant autism and infant asthma could be directly connected to this. The average American home uses 11,000 kilowatt hours a year. By using nuclear, the amount of waste generated would fit in a soda can.
Mr. Vernon?
Yes?
My name is Ashley.
Hello.
I came down to see you last week, but they told me you were in San Francisco.
That's right. What can I do for you, Mr. Ashley?
I wonder if you'd be interested in selling your ranch.
I'm afraid you came at the wrong time. This place is giving a deal of pleasure to a little girl, and at this moment I wouldn't dream of giving it up.
Well, it isn't a matter of giving immediate possession. We have options on the land from here all the way down to the river. But we would like a hold on your place, in case of possible expansion later on.
Expansion for what?
Well, I thought you knew. The whole town's talking of it.
Well, I just got in an hour ago.
Oh, I see. Well, I work for the Atomic Energy Commission. They're going to build a plant here. Well, since you've been away and this is all new to you, naturally you'll need some time to think it over. Maybe it'd be better if I call back again in a day or so.
I'm afraid the answer would still be the same.
I'll call anyway. Goodbye.
In 3 months, this place will be a boom town. Sure, there'll be problems, but there'll be advantages for every one of us. How much is your place worth right now?
About 4,000.
Well, in 6 months, I'll be able to get you 12 for it. Maybe 15.
If he wants to sell. I won't be going to sell. It's my home, Harry. It's where I was born and raised. It's where my folks settled when they come out here in covered wagons. And they looked all over before they picked this as the best spot.
Well, maybe it won't help you so much, but things haven't been too good here for 2 or 3 years. Plenty of people in town that could use a little more money. Harry can tell you about that, can't you, Harry?
I'm afraid I can't. You don't run a bank without knowing the problems people have. All of us have. Money-wise, I mean. And money is what the plant's going to bring to this town.
Of course, I'm not saying that money means happiness, but it's a lot easier when you're not pinching and skimping and worrying year after year.
So it's just a question of money.
Oh, there's more to it than that. Now, you fellows got me elected mayor, and I know what this town needs and how much it needs. A new school building, for one thing. And, Doctor, how far is it to the nearest hospital?
26 miles.
And a decent water system wouldn't hurt.
Looks like we got along without him so far.
Grounds and Sounds Coffee Shop, the only live music venue in Moorhead. Don't look for it, though. It doesn't exist anymore. While I was working on this project, I dropped in there a lot, though. This area of the country has a unique musical heritage, probably the richest in the United States. Maybe that's just my bias showing, but I don't think so. In this little city of 6,000 people, there's more raw talent than in some cities 100 times the size. That Kentucky spirit comes through in everything they do. Let me introduce some of the locals to you.
And I could stand up for what I thought was right, or I could fold up and call it a night. I could beat my head against most any concrete wall, or I could wait till the snow falls. I could lay right down beside the longest stretch of track, listen to the train roll by and never give a damn if it come back.
Putting flags in my hand, if it's all that you think that I put up with your kind, and I'm mighty tired of getting burned. Oh, baby, I'll never forget them words you said to me that night, honey. I'm sorry, but these old flies, well, they just won't fix a thing.
young people play this regional music. It came as kind of a surprise to me. String band music's a way of life around here, though. People play it everywhere, on front porches, at parties, on flatbed trucks. And you never know who will pop up. That's Buddy Ratcliffe. He played with Flat and Scruggs, Little Jimmy Dickens, Merle Travis. He's a legend, playing on a flatbed truck in someone's front yard. I sat down with the Clack Mountain String Band to talk about what it is they do.
Most of what we do are recreations of old tunes, and it is very regional, but it could be a region that spans over all of Appalachia, or a region that's just around here.
That generation is passed on, so a lot of the music would have disappeared with them, but through their work, John Harrod, and Mark Wilson, Gus Mead, and people like that who worked and did archiving for themselves primarily, but later their stuff's released by Rounder and some good record labels who get the music around the world. And there's still a lot of it that's nothing's being done with, especially John Harrod's stuff, and that's been the primary source of my work for the past 3 or 4 years. So.
And that's almost the soul of the music, is passing it from person to person like that. It being passed orally like that, and we're lucky to have the product of what they did to study, listen to, just because we enjoy, not so much study because we're interested in it, but listen to it because we enjoy it and love to play it.
Early recordings, just at somebody's home, on their porch, in their kitchen, anywhere, in the barnyard.
Yeah, for the most part, people, and that's the beautiful thing about it, is for the most part, people are very nice and willing to share what they know. It's more than just the music, it's those people who do the music and their experience that they're able to sit and talk to you about how they learned it, or just talk to you in general about what it is that they do around the house all day, work, whatever, and what the music means to them.
They could be like a crappy person in real life, but when
there are a few of those too.
Yeah, even the guys who normally would have a shotgun at your eye, in between your eyes when you walk up on their property.
And some people,
common thread there.
Yeah, they're glad to show you music.
And my dad's 2 brothers play music, so we spent a lot of time hanging out with them in the summertime at these festivals and conventions and getting to know them and their music, and they introduced me to a lot of interesting types of music other than bluegrass.
It's like a traveling sideshow, going from one convention to the like some freaky Grateful Dead kind of thing. Where people and they flock from one convention to the other, and everybody knows each other, and it's like, hey man, I just learned this tune from this person, and then you learn it from them, and you go home and you've got all this whole new repertoire of tunes that you learn from them, that they learned from that region, that sort of thing.
Hit him a lick, girl. Hit us a lick, girl.
So the basic idea of it is just to create a kind of shuffle pattern, or just that kind of feel, and just use a melody with it.
have to learn that.
Just simple tune with a simple rhythm, but it's not that easy.
More heads above his head down. Whoa, 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 you say, ain't got time to get you down the runway. Peter was a little thing, Peter was a stout. Peter took the measles and Peter petered out. Whoa, 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 you say, ain't got time to get you down the runway. Grandpa had a muley cow, had it since he was born. Took a jag for 40 years to fly from horn to horn. Whoa, whoa, you say, ain't got time to get you down to the runway.
Back at the archives in Flemingsburg, I had a lot more things to look into. Records of exactly what went in the ground at Maxey Flat don't exist. Some shipments were marked not specifically identifiable or mixed fission products. The records do acknowledge the presence of nearly 1,000 pounds of special nuclear material. Special nuclear material is an interesting category. It includes uranium, plutonium, generally transuranic isotopes. In the case of Maxey Flat, there's also americium and neptunium. By definition, special nuclear material can also include anything that the government says is special nuclear material.
At Hanford, Washington, another impossible project proved possible when a huge plant was built for the mass production of the artificial element plutonium. This process involves what may be called the furnace of atomic energy, the reactor pile. Here is a structure or pile of graphite blocks. In the reactor are placed rods of natural uranium containing both U-235 and U-238. As U-235 begins to fission, the graphite slows down the free neutrons, and some of them hit other U-235 atoms, keeping the chain reaction going. But others of those slowed down neutrons hit U-238 atoms, and here's what happens. Remember, we said that U-238 wouldn't support a chain reaction. However, it will capture neutrons from U-235 fission and start a process which converts the U-238 first to neptunium, then to plutonium. And plutonium will fission in chain reaction. Thus, the reactor itself is a source of atomic fuel.
Plutonium groundwater contamination was extremely high near Maxey Flat. The documentation said that the special nuclear material was housed in steel cylinders with ceramic lining. It didn't make sense. Until someone pointed out to me that back in the day, those steel cylinders were discarded industrial water heaters. The pictures seemed to bear that out. I needed to speak to someone who specialized in plutonium groundwater contamination.
A few years ago, I noticed that the drinking water standards that we have for radionuclides, as they concern plutonium and other radionuclides that have similar properties to plutonium, had been based on science from the late 1950s. The drinking water standards were set in 1976, according to that understanding. And the intent was to limit doses to the most exposed part of the body, which was then understood to be the bone, to about a few millirem, a small amount of radiation. The science since the 1970s, when the drinking water standards were created by the EPA, has changed a lot. Our understanding of how plutonium behaves in the body has changed a lot. In other words, where it goes in the body and what cells it targets, and so what parts of the body it creates cancer risk, that has changed a lot. So we've changed our understanding from sort of it going to the skeleton other than the marrow, bone marrow, to specific target cells on the surface of the bone. So the parts of the body that plutonium attacks the most, once it, say, gets past the lungs and into the bloodstream, are very specifically understood today to be the bone surface, which is the most vulnerable. And then there are other parts also that are more affected, but the bone surface is most affected. The other thing that has happened is the understanding of how much damage plutonium causes per amount that is taken into the body has changed. We now believe that plutonium is much more dangerous or risky than what was believed in the 1970s. When I added it all up, I realized that there's a group of radionuclides, plutonium, americium, neptunium, that taken together, the allowable standard for maximum contaminants in drinking water was about 100 times 2 lakhs. 100 times 2 lakhs. Well, Mr. Jackson, I have not studied Maxey Flats in detail. I've looked at the numbers that you sent me in this table D3, radionuclide concentrations in groundwater, which you've told me are from 1988. And I find that a number of these concentrations in the wells that were tested are quite high, especially for plutonium-238 and in some cases for tritium also. And this groundwater, of course, is not being used for drinking, as I understand, and is not part of a public water supply system. This would, however, make a case, in my opinion, that the plutonium from the Maxey Flats is leaking into the groundwater in significant amounts, and therefore the parts of Maxey Flats where significant amounts of plutonium were dumped should be remediated by removal of much or most of the plutonium rather than just covering it. That's what these data would indicate. The idea of suggesting that the EPA should make these standards more stringent is that these sites should be cleaned up in a way that would not require permanent surveillance for hundreds of years or thousands of years, because this is generally regarded to be infeasible. For instance, the National Academy of Sciences recognizes that for very long periods of time, one should generally assume loss of site control. So that you may have fences today, and this is a good thing to keep people out of it. You may post signs that people should not use the water, but these are temporary measures. And when you have contamination to the levels indicated here, especially in regard to plutonium, you would need to take measures for the long term that would assume loss of site control. Now that would not be the case for tritium, because tritium is relatively short-lived, and so long as you're not dumping more, it'll go away in about 100 years.
Well, now we've heard most everybody's point of view, and it seems to me mostly against the bomb, so if somebody will just move a motion deploring it, we'll take a vote on it and go home.
What good would that do?
Well, ease our consciences a little, I guess, and make us feel better about the whole business.
Well, that's not the point of this meeting. The point is to keep the plant from coming here.
Well, that's a kind of a tough proposition, isn't it? You just can't argue with something like the Atomic Energy Commission.
Why not? The Atomic Energy Commission is part of the government. The government is elected to work for us. Seems to me it's our duty as citizens to speak out when they do something we disagree with.
The Commonwealth of Kentucky Department of Waste Management runs Maxey Flat now. During the years I worked on this project, I visited the site several times. These are environmental engineers. They don't bear any of the responsibility for what happened here. They're trying to make the best out of a situation that was dropped in their laps. The site is massive. It's been covered with a geomembrane liner. The idea is that if water can't make its way into the trenches, then it can't be driven further down into the earth. There is existing contamination, though. To their credit, the Commonwealth of Kentucky have bought land surrounding the site, and it forms a buffer zone. The staff here at the site take water samples from these solar-powered sampling stations. They're testing for tritium. Testing for the other isotopes present at Maxey Flat is done by the Commonwealth. I visited their labs in Frankfurt on several occasions. It was very difficult for me to get groundwater data, but I finally got it. If the documents I obtained are accurate, there are still areas where plutonium groundwater contamination is far above legal limits.
Is it really hot out there?
I didn't even really notice it. There's this caravan in front of me. I don't know if it's an illusion or it's really there. There's all these people on the liner. Can't see anything.
Of course, the Commonwealth isn't actually violating any laws because those limits are only in place for groundwater in areas where people use wells. Most of the residents around Maxey Flat are on city water now. So from a legal standpoint, there's absolutely no wrongdoing. The crops growing from the soil on Maxey Flat, the cows across the road drinking from a pond, the children playing in a stream don't have a thing to worry about. One of the largest farms on the flat was recently split up into parcels. Families will be moving into new homes up there pretty soon.
I'll step across the line and I'll do this one.
The workers here are very careful about checking themselves out for radioactive contamination.
And then I'll hand off the Tom.
Put it on the thing, Jigger.
And you point it down so nothing can get in.
Of course, you gotta scan your hand before you touch it. Your hand's contaminated. What'd you get, Scott, or have you already?
80. I didn't log you out.
Despite my griping and cynicism, these people do take their job seriously. They don't just work here, they live around here. A lot of them are raising families here. They take their job seriously and they're vigilant. Still, the top of a mountain in a damp climate, soil that's considered a fractured flow medium, meaning that if any of the contaminants do become mobile, they don't know what direction it'll travel. And add to that water heaters full of transuranic isotopes that could conceivably be used to build weapons. It's a bad situation. I suspect that it wouldn't be tolerated anywhere else. I wanted to see how we dispose of transuranic waste now. I drove to Carlsbad, New Mexico to visit the waste isolation pilot plant. There they dispose of transuranic wastes in a salt vein nearly a half a mile underground. A search for a suitable location got underway in the 50s. A salt vein so wide it stretches from Carlsbad, New Mexico to Lawrence, Kansas was finally decided on. Thousands of shipments of radioactive waste have been delivered here from all over the country. The waste is placed in excavated rooms deep underground, which eventually collapse, sealing the radioactive waste in a layer of salt. Still, this wasn't the first time the nuclear industry has come to Carlsbad, New Mexico.
In Carlsbad, New Mexico, the stage is set for the first experiment aimed at turning the wrath and power of the A-bomb to peaceful uses. The nuclear device will be exploded in a cavern a quarter of a mile deep in salt rock, and the test is designed to give scientists some of the answers to the problems of funneling nuclear power into channels beneficial to man. The 1,000-foot-long tunnel leads to a final bend where the explosion will be set off. The device will be a small one, equal to about 5,000 tons of TNT, a fraction of the smallest bomb in Russia's recent tests. Project Gnome is the first step in Project Plowshare, which scientists hope will lead to the ultimate use of nuclear materials for trapping underground heat to turn turbines that will generate electricity. The cavern where the blast will take place is so shielded that there is no possibility of any pollution of the atmosphere. The $6 million project is a major step in peaceful atomic use.
It didn't work out exactly as they planned. When the device detonated, the blast doors didn't hold. Radioactive steam escaped up the shaft. Though Project Gnome didn't work out the way the Department of Energy hoped, the WHIP project is accomplishing quite a bit.
And some of them look taller than others.
The waste arrives here in these TruePack containers, which are then taken inside the building for characterization. That means determining exactly what kind of waste is inside. Given that WHIP handles some of the most dangerous substances known to mankind, they have an amazing safety record. WHIP runs a world-class operation here. Safety measures include this massive ventilation system. It can completely isolate the caverns below from the surface in case of a containment breach, sucking all the air through a filtration system in seconds. Lifts operate constantly, bringing salt up from the excavation below. With an excavated area equal to the size of 50 or 60 football fields, a lot of salt has to make its way to the surface. Descending into the facility is more than a little unnerving. You get a small brass coin with a number on it, so they'll know who was crushed if there's a cave-in. Once you clear the deck, the lift really drops. Traveling through miles of tunnels and airlocks, it's hard not to be overwhelmed. The Department of Energy is cleaning up radioactive waste sites all over the United States and bringing the contents here. Since Maxey Flat wasn't a federal site, it's not eligible for their program. Eligible or not, all that waste belongs down here. That plutonium and uranium doesn't belong up on top of a mountain. It belongs down here, 2,500 feet underground. It's strange to find yourself staring at stacked barrels of radioactive waste.
Okay, let's talk about these little nodules here. These are interesting. What do you think formed this nodule? This salt crystal, salt growth. That salt, you can see behind it, is crystallized, but this is a sort of a flowery, powdery, granular form, and that's formed as a result of water on the inside of the rock coming out of the rock through the disturbed rock fractures, reaching the outside, the air here, where it's the first time it's seen air in 200 million years, and of course the water evaporates, and what's left behind is a brine deposition, a nodule of salt, of fresh salt. Still, it's 200 million year old salt. Once it's on the machine, this thing has been lined up next to that locking ring assembly that you saw down there on the rib, and it's aligned with a hole in the rib, 26-inch diameter hole that goes in 14 feet approximately. Then with the cask here, all shielded and everything, the shield door is open. This remote-controlled solenoid pushes the canister into the wall. It then retracts, the shield door closes, a 4-foot concrete plug is then inserted into exactly the same location as the canister, and the solenoid, the shield door opens and the solenoid pushes the plug into the wall as well. So then you have this canister of remote handled waste, 4 feet embedded into that wall, and the salt itself provides the radiation shielding.
This isn't like anything I've ever seen in my life.
Panel number 4. So panel number 3 has no remote handled waste in it. This is panel 3. Panel 4, which is 500 feet in that direction, will have, it's not ready yet, but it will have holes made into the ribs like this, all the way around, okay? On 8 to 10 foot centers, depending upon the waste receipts rate. Line all of these holes
and then
on
wait
all
for the
of
stuff
the rooms
to
of
come
the panel. You line them
as you need them. Okay, I got it.
This didn't seem anything at all like Maxey Flat. Despite what happened at Maxey Flat, I still think that nuclear is the best way to get our power right now. The French have had a nearly spotless record with their nuclear program. They don't bury their waste. They store it, and they wait for safe disposal technologies to develop. Making this film's been like therapy for me. I've had so many questions all my life about what happened up at Maxey Flat. Now I wonder if there's any way to get that waste cleaned up. When local musician Sasha Collette offered to play a few songs at my family cemetery, I thought it was really sweet. Who knows how long it's been since anyone's played music there.
Well, Tennessee, she sure is beautiful. From her mountain tops to old pottery shops, and the Carolinas with their barefoot shores. But they shut my eyes and help me to see.
After spending months in a town that felt like home, it was hard to pack up and head back to California. I'm still not sure I shouldn't have just stayed.